Are you a preacher that had to preach through an interpreter at least once in your lifetime? Was that a great experience? Hi, my name is Elena Trukhan, Doctor of Biblical Studies and an interpreter for over 32 years. Allow me to help you today to make your preaching experience with an interpreter a great one. Here what happens when you preach, and here's what interpreter must do in order to convey your message to your audience. When you say a phrase or a sentence, an interpreter must be able to hear it, to comprehend it, formulate it, meaning interpret into his or her language, remember it, and verbalize it. What happens if the preacher does not wait for interpreter to finish? I believe that is one of the greatest challenges for the interpreter and the preacher as well. Because the preacher doesn't always wait, because he feels that if he has to wait, his message is no longer so anointed, so powerful, or for one simple reason just does not want to wait, or maybe because he does not know how to work with interpreter, doesn't have previous experience, or simply doesn't have any training. And that is probably one of the greatest reasons why interpreter and preacher don't always work great as a team. Sometimes it also happens because a preacher thinks that interpreter is taking too long. And when the preacher talks over the interpreter, the very first effect, the audience is confused. They can't understand either you as the preacher or the interpreter because you are talking right over him. So what's been achieved so far is cacophony. Now let's go back to step number 1 and see how we can make it a great experience, just as I promised in the very beginning. Because the interpreter must be able to hear you, don't look away as you speak, or don't turn with your back towards interpreter, which even worse. Or you must have an absolutely wonderful, a very good sounding system. Interpreter must be able to understand what you just said. So use either very simple or common words, or find an interpreter in advance, or a professional interpreter that will be able to interpret on a spot. In those very few seconds that you give your interpreter to interpret what you just said, interpreter must formulate what you said in your language. In this case would be English. Interpreter must translate it into a target language, the language of the audience you're trying to communicate with. So the interpreter must be funny if you're funny. If you're using a professional language, the interpreter must know the professional language. If you're using historical facts, the interpreter must be knowledgeable enough to know what you are talking about. If you're using biblical terminology, let's say you are preaching right out of King James Version Bible, interpreter must be familiar with that language. So what's best to do is to use, as I said, more common words or simple words. What I suggest, though, the best thing in this case is to know ahead of time who your interpreter will be. And this is one of my biggest requests to you as a preacher. Forward your sermon, be that a written copy, typed out copy, or maybe even a video of your practice. Forward that message to the interpreter ahead, let's say a few weeks ahead before you actually have to preach. Allow the interpreter to be prepared as well. Interpreter must remember everything you have said from the very beginning, from the very first word to the very last word, and has to keep it in his mind until the very end of his sentence while he is interpreting it. If a preacher becomes impatient at this time and starts talking over the interpreter, so think of what happens in the interpreter's mind as the interpreter has to do the double job. Not only now they have to hear you, understand you, formulate mind, and remember everything. Now they have to listen to you and try to remember everything you're saying as they're still saying, verbalizing the previous sentence, and still remember what you said now, the next sentence, and then still take the process all over while still not finished with the previous statement. One of the greatest reasons why this happens is because preachers don't have any training or have very little training on how to work with interpreters. Let me show you this from another angle. You see, I also had a radio talk show for a number of years, and I know how long it takes to prepare a sermon. On an average, it takes about 6 to 8 hours to prepare a good, interesting sermon of a good quality. So if it takes, let's say, at least 6 hours to prepare it, how many minutes is that? 360 minutes. How many seconds is that? 6 hours is 21,600 seconds. You have invested 21,600 seconds at least to prepare your message. The interpreter is allowed only 2 to 3 seconds to do the job that you worked so hard on, that you prayed so hard for and asked the Lord for the message to bring to the people that you're going to talk to. And yet, the interpreter is expected to be as good as you are, to convey your message in the best possible way in less than few seconds. Let me again give you just few points on how to make it a successful preaching experience if you have to use an assistance of the interpreter. As I've mentioned before, ahead of time, try to get your sermon to the interpreter so interpreter can get used to how you think, get used to your vocabulary, and just practice ahead of time. And if the interpreter has to look up a few words himself, that would be something an interpreter should be allowed to do it. If you ever have to preach and you were not notified that you will be working with an interpreter, just use an old-fashioned rule. Be polite, be courteous. And my personal request to you is just give time for interpreter to do his job. Wait for him or her to finish his sentence or a paragraph, and this will make your sermon of high quality, clear, and a powerful message. Remember, you had at least 21,600 seconds to prepare your message. He has less than a few. May the Lord help you and bless you to be a successful preacher with or without an interpreter. God bless you.